as I mentioned, we are recording today's session, and that's to ensure that classmates of yours that are unable to attend today can still kind of join the session at a later date and see what we've been chatting about. So, just to clarify that you're in the right place or the place that you wanted to be in. This session is going to be talking about how do we prepare for role plays, because regardless of the course you are in, whether it's the community services courses or the mental health courses that we run, it's highly likely that you will have to do a role play with a teacher at some point, and you may also record some role plays with some classmates or some colleagues as well. And for many of us, myself included, the idea of doing a role play assessment for some reason brings up a lot of extra nerves, some worry, some anxiety, some uncertainty. And students have often told us that the idea of doing a role play really kind of gets them a little bit on edge. So we've developed this webinar as a way to try to help people manage a little bit some of those worries and concerns. And what students have told us is that although the beginning of their role plays and when they're getting ready for their role plays, they feel quite nervous and a bit uncertain or worried, by the time they actually do their role plays and get to the end of the role play session, they often are saying things like, that was nowhere near as difficult as I thought it was going to be. It wasn't as scary as I thought it was going to be. And some students actually even enjoy the role play process because it gives you a chance to practice your skills, gives you a chance to show off your skills and your knowledge, and it's a great opportunity to get some feedback from a teacher in real time, then and there on the spot. So our focus today will be looking at how we can prepare for our role plays and also how we might structure the first kind of aspects of our role play as well. So again, for folks that came in late, this is just a little reminder that we are recording today's session. The session will be used for teaching purposes and it will only be available to TAFE Digital students that are enrolled in our community services and mental health courses. Okay. So before we move on too much further, it's really important for us just to pause for a moment and acknowledge that even though we're in a digital space, that we are all logging into this webinar from unceded Aboriginal land and acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of the land that we're all joining this webinar from. And offer our thanks and respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that thanks to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander folks that are joining us in today's session. And when I'm always really mindful of when I'm doing the acknowledgement of country for this session, that TAFE is a place where the sharing of knowledge and wisdom is formalised. And there's a very long and strong history of the sharing of knowledge and wisdom in this country, dating back over 60,000 years. And that knowledge and wisdom can be shared in a range of ways, both formal and informal. And so hopefully today we'll be sharing some ideas with each other in that spirit. So, folks, this is just a little reminder for all of us. Because we are logging into this session from maybe the comfort of our home, maybe our workplace, maybe we're in the car, we just want to think about it, though, as if we are actually in a classroom all together or an office space all together. And so I suppose there's three guidelines that we usually invite students to kind of agree to, and us as teachers would also be adhering to these. And essentially the three guidelines are, firstly, that we treat each other with respect. So some of the ways that we can do that in this space, for example, are things like if we're not talking, that we have our microphones on mute. And the reason for that is because if we all have our microphones on at the same time, we get a bit of a feedback loop. And that can kind of cause that ringing sensation for people and make it difficult to hear. Another one of our guidelines is that we treat the learning space with respect as well. And so one of the ways that we can do that is by being mindful that anything we put in the chat box, everybody will be able to see. So the way we use the chat box, we want people to use the chat box, and I can see that loads of people already are, which is great because you're popping in your name and your TAFE ID number. So we encourage you to use that chat box, but just be mindful that everybody in the session will be able to see what you type. And the third thing is that we encourage you to show yourself that same degree of respect. And one of the easiest ways that we can demonstrate that in the session is by asking questions. If you've got a question, please feel free at any point in time to turn your microphone on and ask, or to type it in the chat box. Or you can put your hand up and ask the question. This is your time. You folks are giving up your time to be here, so we want it to be as helpful and useful as possible. So please feel free to ask questions as we're going along. And by asking questions, not only are you helping yourself, but it's a really generous thing to do because you're likely helping out your classmates. Because if you have a question about something, it's highly likely that another person in this group has a similar question. So please feel free to ask questions as we're going along. And I can see that Susan has already modeled that for us. So Susan was asking about any tips around getting your camera to work. So Susan, it sounds like you've done all of the troubleshooting things that we normally do. So around kind of checking that the button for that the camera is switched on and so on. If it's not working today, that's not going to impact too much your experience of the webinar. However, it will be important that you have a working camera for your actual role plays. So what I'll do once our session is finished, Susan, is I will send you a little bit of information about troubleshooting for MS Teams, and I'll also provide you with the TAFE IT contact details. So if this happens again, you've got some resources at hand. Okay. So for many of us, this might be the first time that we're using MS Teams. Today might be the very first time that you've actually had a go at logging into Teams, and you might be trying to figure out, where things are and how they work, and where the chat box is and these kinds of things. So before we get really kind of into the role play specific information, I'm just going to run us through some very basic Teams functions that are essential for you to have working when you're doing your role plays with a teacher. Okay, so there is a couple of core Teams functions that you absolutely will need to have working and available when you do your role play. So on the screen at the moment is a screenshot of what I can see. Now, I've been using a laptop. If you've logged into this session, say on your mobile phone, some of these functions may be in a slightly different position, okay? So there's three core functions that you will need to have available and working when you do your role plays, folks. So the first one is a working microphone, and hopefully people can see where I'm pointing to the icon or the little picture that depicts the microphone. So the microphone icon, it kind of looks like an old school radio microphone, and it says mic underneath it. So you will need to make sure that you have a working microphone when you do your role plays, because of course the teacher will need to be able to hear you. The next function that you will need to make sure you have available when you do your role plays is right next door to the microphone, and it's the camera function. So the icon for the camera function kind of looks like an old school video camera. And the camera function is required because the teacher needs to be able to see you when they do the role play. For example, they're going to be assessing your body language as part of your overall role play performance. And so they need to be able to see you so they can note things like your facial expressions, your eye contact, and those kinds of things. So you'll need to have a working camera for your role plays, and it will need to be switched on. Okay. The third function that I like to point out to people is the chat box. So hopefully you can see that I'm pointing to the chat box here on the screen. Now the chat box icon, it looks like a speech bubble and it says chat underneath it. Now, when you click on that icon, you'll get this window that opens down the side of your screen that I'm kind of circling now with the pointer. And that is where we can chat to each other. We can type comments to each other. You can post emojis if you're the kind of person that likes to use emojis as well. Now, the reason the chat box is helpful for your role plays is because from time to time, we might have a little IT issue. You know, maybe your screen freezes over, or maybe the sound drops out, or maybe the video cuts out. Now, if that happens during the role play, usually you will still always be able to access the chat component of the role play session. Okay, so you'll be able to type into the chat box and say, you know, hi Glenn, unfortunately my video has just dropped out. I'm going to log out and log back in. Or similarly, if the teacher has an IT issue, they'll be able to type to you in the chat and try and problem solve it. Okay. So these three functions, you absolutely will need to make sure that you have them available when you're doing your role plays, microphone, camera, and chat, and that you're somewhat familiar with how to use them. Okay. Thanks, Susan, for letting me know that the pointer is not necessarily coming up on your screen. I have highlighted each of those icons in the image that's on the screen as well. So there's little red or blue boxes drawn around them. So hopefully, even if you can't see the pointer, you'll still be able to kind of see the icons that I've been discussing. Okay, so now that we've got a very basic understanding of how Teams looks and works, or the core functions, if you haven't already, I'm going to ask folks just to type into the chat box, please, your name and your student ID number. So if you could please, if you're comfortable doing that, type your name and your student ID number into the chat box. And that will allow us to record your attendance at this session. So if you're happy to do that, just your first name and student ID number is fine. And if you can pop that in the chat box, that would be wonderful. And it just kind of gives us a chance to practice using one of the functions. Awesome. I can see some folks are already doing that. Great. Christopher, thank you. Daniel, wonderful. Great.
Popping in to say hello.
Great. Hey, so folks, Jess is back. I'm just going to pause here for a moment. Many of you probably met Jess a touch earlier on, but if you've joined the session more recently, Jess is a colleague of mine, and so it's great having her in this session because Jess will be able to help us with a whole range of things. For example, there's, over 30 of us in here. I might accidentally miss a question that you type in the chat box, but Jess has eagle eyes and will be keeping an eye on those things for us. So if you've got questions that you want to pop in the chat box, please do so, and Jess will be able to ask them for you. Jess also has some really great experience working in the community services and mental health sector. So Jess might chime in from time to time with a thought or idea as well. So thanks, Jess, for joining us.
No problem.
So folks, I just want to pause for a moment just to highlight that in a moment, we're going to be looking at a case study to help us kind of make sense of role plays. And the case studies that you will be using in your role plays are all taken from real life scenarios because we want them to be as close to, work environments and work settings as possible. But what that means for us is that it's highly likely that somebody in this session, or maybe somebody we know, has had a similar experience to something that we're going to talk about in the scenario. And that might bring up for us difficult, uncomfortable, overwhelming thoughts, feelings, memories. If that happens at any point in time during today's session, please feel free you can privately message Jess or myself. You just type our name into the chat box, and you can send us private messages and we'll be able to point you in the direction of support services or look to connect with you after the session just to check in. But we just want to be really mindful of taking care of ourselves and taking care of each other. And that brings us back to that initial point around, how we discuss things in the chat box and those kinds of things as well. If there's things that you do that help you to kind of feel grounded and recentered, please feel free to do them during the session as well, if you can. If you want to pop your camera off so you can just take a moment to do some breathing, you're very welcome to do so, just as one example. And there's some support numbers up on the screen there as well if people are looking to connect with support, including the no-cost confidential professional counselling that all TAFE students can access through TAFE. Okay, so Jess, I just saw your hand pop up.
Yes, sorry, I thought I was stuck on the wrong screen, but it changed, so we're all good. I just wanted to make sure.
Thank you. Okay, so let's start talking role plays, folks. Now, as I mentioned, regardless of whether you're a Certificate 3 student in the community services or a Certificate 4 student, say doing mental health, or a diploma student, you will be doing some role plays at some point during your TAFE study. And role plays can, for many of us, bring up feelings of nervousness, maybe some little pangs of anxiety might visit with us when we're thinking about our role plays, or we might just be a little bit unsure about what to expect. And so with that in mind, we spoke with students and we spoke with teachers about what would be some useful advice we could share with students around how to best prepare for your role plays. And essentially what they came up with was 4 top tips. So we're going to have a little look at the 4 top tips now together. So the first tip that students came up with was it's really important to read through all of the case studies that you're going to be using in the role plays. Now, for many of you, when you are looking at a role play assignment, you might notice that there's 3 case studies. If that's the case, you will need to be familiar with all 3 scenarios, okay? Because you will work with all 3 of those clients in your role play assessment task. So if, when you're looking at your assessment, if there's multiple scenarios, please make sure that you have a good read through all of the scenarios that are there, because you'll work with each of those clients in your session. So I've popped up on the screen here. This is a real scenario that is taken from our Certificate 4 course. And this is an example of a case study or a scenario that you will be getting in your assignment. So what we really encourage you to do is have a good read through the case study. And as you're reading through it, if there's sections in the case study that kind of jump out or stand out to you as being maybe important for you to remember, or maybe you think it's giving you a little bit of helpful or useful information, or maybe it's a section where you're like, I'm kind of curious about that. I wonder what that means for this client. What we encourage you to do is to take notes about those bits. or to highlight those sections as you're reading through the case study. So in our example that's on the screen, as I've been reading through this scenario, there's a few sections I've highlighted. So I've highlighted, for example, that I'm a male worker in a community centre, because that seems important for me to keep in mind when I'm doing this role play, that I'm male and that I work in a community centre, because that gives me a little bit of context around what my job role is. So if I work in a community centre, I'm likely a community worker. I'm not a counsellor. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a housing expert. I'm a community-based worker. And as I read through, it tells me that I work in a small town and a family has just settled in the area, having sought asylum from their non-English speaking country of origin. So I've highlighted there that I'm working with a family. Seems important for me to keep in mind. And I've definitely highlighted that this is a family that have English as a second language and have come to Australia seeking asylum. That seems really important for me to remember about this particular client. I continue to read on, and it tells me that the mother and daughter from the family have been referred to my service for information on local services, including recommendations on healthcare providers. So I've highlighted some sections there. I've highlighted that I'm working with mum and daughter. That might be important for me to be aware of, especially as I'm aware that I'm a male worker. I've also highlighted what they're coming in for. The case study kind of points out that they're coming in for information on local services, in particular health services. So I've highlighted that because that kind of is giving me a little bit of insight as to what they might want to be discussing with me. And it goes on to say that the mother appears very uncomfortable interacting with you and avoids eye contact. So I've highlighted that as kind of being important for me to keep in mind because I'm a little bit curious. I wonder what that's about. I wonder if it's because I'm a male and she's female, or is it because maybe there's a language barrier? Or is it because she's not quite sure what to expect from a service like mine? So I'm starting to think, like, I wonder why that might be happening. So tip number one is to have a really good read through all of your scenarios and make some little notes about the sections that maybe stand out to you as being important to remember, or that perhaps you're curious to find out some more information about. So once we've read through our case study, tip number two is to then have a really good look at the observation checklist. So the observation checklist is what the teacher is going to be using to mark you during the role play. And I've got on screen, this is an example of a real observation checklist that relates to our case study. So the observation checklist usually looks like a table, and you will usually find it in your assessment document after the case studies. So usually you'll have your case studies first, and then the observation checklist will usually follow in the pages after the case studies. Okay. Now, the observation checklist, it's really important and helpful that you have a good look at this for a couple of reasons. So one of the reasons is it is going to give you some really great guidance and tips on the kinds of skills and knowledge you will need to demonstrate in order to pass your role plays, because this is what the teacher is actually looking for. This is what they're marking you with. So for example, if I look at this observation checklist, I can see things like I'm going to need to demonstrate active listening in order to pass this role play. So I'm thinking, how will I demonstrate active listening? What does that mean? I better make sure I know what that is. I'm looking at things like it tells me I need to make use of open and closed questions. So I'm thinking, okay, I need to make sure in my role play that I'm going to ask some open questions and I'm going to ask some closed questions because the observation checklist tells me I need to demonstrate that. It tells me things like I might need to demonstrate appropriate body language. So again, I'm kind of thinking, okay, I need to be mindful of trying to make eye contact from time to time with my client. which can be tricky when we're on Teams, right? Let's acknowledge that. But that we from time to time try to make that eye contact, or at very least are looking in the direction of our client. But we're also aware of things like our posture and our facial expressions and so on. So the observation checklist will give you some really good guidance on the things that you will need to demonstrate in order to pass the assignment. But the other reason it's really helpful to look at the observation checklist is because it will also give you some really great clues around subject-specific knowledge and skills that you will also need to include in your role play. So, for example, this observation checklist is telling me that as part of my role play, I need to demonstrate awareness around potential barriers that may come up in the role play, especially around things that might relate to language barriers, gender barriers, experiences that clients have had with, past power systems and these kinds of things. And it also tells me that not only do I need to demonstrate an awareness, but I also need to be able to address those barriers or take some action to try and minimize those barriers. So the observation checklist, in some ways, will fit together with our case study like a bit of a jigsaw puzzle piece. And I'm going to kind of talk about what that means. So I'm thinking the observation checklist has told me I need to be aware of things like language barriers or gender issues, and I need to take appropriate action. So if I go back to my case study, I can start to look and go, it mentioned gender, potential gender issues. It tells me I'm male. It tells me I'm working with mum and daughter. Maybe that's why mum's uncomfortable with me. So I need to take some action to address that. Maybe I need to check in with mum around her comfort levels. Maybe I need to offer to leave the door open during our session if that would help mum to feel more comfortable. Maybe I need to think about, would mum prefer to have a female colleague come and join our session? Okay. But the observation checklist also spoke about language barriers. And the case study tells us that this family has English as a second language. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, what might I need to do here? Perhaps I might need to check in around interpreting services. Would this family like to have an interpreter available during our session? So we can see how our case study and our observation checklist start to kind of fit together, and how they are clues that help us prepare for our role plays. So we've had a good read of our case studies and taken some little notes. We've had a good look at our observation checklist, and we're getting a picture of the skills and the knowledge that we need to demonstrate during our role plays. The third tip that students gave us was, once we've done those two things, it's important to do a little bit of research around possible agencies or services that you might be able to refer your clients to during the session. So for most of your role plays, folks, there'll usually be a criteria that relates to you having an understanding around what is within your scope of practice or your boundaries as say a community worker, and what might fall outside of your scope of practice as a community worker. And in those instances where things are falling outside of your scope of practice, we will be looking that you're able to refer your client to an appropriate service. And we do ask that they are real services, so that they are real services in your local area, whether that's in your local community or whether it's a service that's a little bit outside your local area, that's okay as well. Because we understand that some folks might live smack bang in the middle of Sydney and they've got loads of referral options, around them. but many of our students might live in more kind of rural or remote areas. And so your referral options might be a little bit more limited. So it's okay to find services that are outside your area as well, if that's the case. So we want you to do a little bit of research around possible referral agencies. And a really great starting point for this, folks, is a website called Ask Izzy. So I've got a little screenshot of what Ask Izzy looks like up on the screen there. Now, Ask Izzy it's essentially a directory of all of the community services across the state. So I'm a little bit older now. And so if you're a little bit older like me, you might remember the yellow pages. Ask Izzy is kind of like the yellow pages of community services. Okay, it's this big directory that lists all of the community services across the state. So it's a really great starting point. It's a website free to use. And what makes Ask Izzy even better is that you can ask it to search by postcode, for example. So you could put in your local postcode and it will only show you services that work in that area. Another feature that it has that makes it really great is you can ask it to search by specialty area. So we can see on the screen just a couple of examples of specialty areas. So one of them is housing. So if I was looking for an accommodation service for a client, I would use Ask Izzy and I would just search its housing database. And it's only going to show me services that provide accommodation or housing to clients. Or similarly, if I was looking for a domestic violence service, I could ask it to only show me services that work with folks who are experiencing family and domestic violence. It has a range of other specialty areas that aren't included in this screenshot, sorry, but like alcohol and other drug services, youth services. So it's a really great starting point if you're not quite sure of the services in your area. Yeah, so it is a bit like True Local, I think. I'm not super au fait with True Local, but you can ask it to search by geographical area. You can ask it to search by specialty area. You can ask it to search by things like even things like gender base and these kinds of things. Okay, so our third tip is do a bit of research around possible referral agencies that you think might be helpful for your clients. So if we think back to our case study, it tells me that this is a family that have come to Australia seeking asylum. It tells me that they're looking for health providers and local services. And it also tells me that I'm working with mum and daughter. So I might do a bit of research around things like women's health services in my area. So I might use Ask Izzy to locate a women's health service. Or I might use Ask Izzy to do a search for services that work specifically with folks that have English as a second language. Or services that work specifically with folks that have come to Australia seeking asylum. And it will bring up those agencies for me. The amazing Jess has just popped the link to Ask Izzy in the chat box, so you can easily find it and have a little bit of a play around. So here's a couple of examples of services I found that might be appropriate for our case study. So one of the services I found was, let's imagine that the daughter in our case study is a young person and maybe she's experiencing anxiety or perhaps some mental health issues. So I used Ask Izzy and I found Ashfield Headspace. So Ashfield Headspace is an organisation that works with young people around mental health, and they might be a really great referral option for this family's daughter. I've also found an organisation called Starts. Now, Starts is an organisation that works specifically with people that have come to Australia seeking asylum and who may have experienced torture or trauma. And they provide counselling services, they run groups, they work with children, young people and adults. So I've got them listed as a possible referral for this agency as well. So we do our research and we just are going to make notes. We'll write down a list of a few different possible referral agencies for our clients. So that's our third tip. We've read through our case studies and made some little notes. We've had a good look at the observation checklist, so we're clear on what we need to do and how we might demonstrate our skills. And then we've done a bit of research and we've got a little list of possible referral agencies for our clients. The fourth tip that students have given us in regards to preparing for your role plays is, if possible, do a little bit of a practice run. It's almost like kind of forming some muscle memory around, like, the more we do things, hopefully, we just become a little bit more comfortable with them. So lots of students have said that they've done a practice run for their role plays, and there's two ways that we could do this. One of the ways that students do a practice run is they ask a friend, a family member, a colleague, somebody they know to help them to do a practice. So they ask their friend or their colleague to play the part of the client, and they'll run through the role play. They'll have a practice with a friend or a colleague. But not all of us have a friend or a colleague or a family member that's, able to help us with doing a practice run. So in those instances, what students have done is they've used their phone or a tablet or their laptop or some other similar device, and they record themselves doing aspects of the role play. So for example, they might record themselves, say, greeting a client, introducing themselves as a worker, and asking the client how their morning has been. Or they might record themselves explaining privacy and confidentiality to their clients, and also explaining mandatory reporting requirements to their clients. And then what they've done is they go back and watch the recording, and they're able to notice things like, how did I look? What was my body language like? Did I cover all of the things that I really wanted to cover in my explanation about privacy and confidentiality? So you can kind of go back and reflect on your preparation work. So if you're able to, folks, doing a little bit of a practice run can be really helpful, whether that is practicing with another person or whether it is recording yourself or something similar where you can kind of watch it back and just reflect on, how you looked, how you sounded, did you cover all of the aspects that you were hoping to cover? So these are the top 4 tips that came up from students and teachers: having a good read of our case studies and taking some little notes, having a good look at the observation checklist and being clear on the skills and knowledge that you'll need to demonstrate, doing a bit of research around possible referral agencies that might be able to work with your clients, and if possible, doing a little bit of a practice run. I'm going to pause there for a moment because I know you've heard loads of my voice. And some of you might be sitting there very patiently and politely waiting for me to stop so you can ask a question. So I'm going to pause here for a moment and throw it over to you folks to see, are there any questions or comments at the moment that people would like to raise?
Okay, I would like to have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
I don't understand, what is the role play about here? Like, what do we need to do? Like, just a case study that you just show a moment that we use that one for our role play?
Yeah,
For
okay, great.
non-speaking?
Yep. So the role, I'll have a little bit of I'll give you a little bit of an overview of kind of what the role play assessments are actually, what they're for, what their purpose is, and what to expect. So for some of your assignments, you will need to demonstrate practical skills and practical knowledge. So what that means is instead of like writing about something, kind of writing about your understanding, what we're going to ask you to do instead is show us your skills and show us your knowledge and show us your understanding. Okay. And so that's when we use role plays. So role plays are an opportunity for you as students to show a teacher or demonstrate to a teacher your skills, for example, communication skills. That's one of the core things that we're assessing with role plays. So your communication skills can include things like body language, can include things like how you use open and closed questions, can include things like paraphrasing. So that's where we kind of repeat back a snapshot of what a client has told us, kind of like the core theme of what a client has told us, to check that we're understanding what they're sharing with us, but also to demonstrate that we're listening. So role plays are a practical demonstration of your skills with a teacher. Okay. Now, when you do your role play assessments, if they're done live with a teacher, it will just be you and the teacher in that session. So it's not like a big session like we're in now where there's lots of students. It's just you and the teacher. So it's a private session. So there won't be other people watching or any observing the session. Okay. And the teacher will have two main kind of jobs during that session. The two main jobs of the teacher are, firstly, they're going to play your client. Okay. So they will be playing each of your clients in the role play session. They'll act as the client. The other job that the teacher has is they're also observing your skills and your knowledge because they're doing the assessment. So they're noticing when you demonstrate the use of open questions, so they can tick it off on that observation checklist. Okay. You will always be given case studies for your role plays. There will always be a case study or case studies for you to be familiar with. So you won't ever go into a role play and have absolutely no idea, what the issue is going to be that you're working around or who the client is, for example. And so that's why we really encourage you to have a really good look through those case studies so you can be kind of nice and familiar with what you think might come up, what might be some of the themes that might come up in the role play. Okay. And the role play sessions, one of the things that students really enjoy about the role play sessions is that you get feedback in real time from your teacher. So after each of the scenarios that you do with the teacher, there'll be time for you to chat with the teacher. They'll give you feedback. They'll say, oh, these are the things that you've done really well. The way you used that open question, you really did a great job of showing empathy. But they'll also be able to talk with you about the areas that you might be able to expand on and develop further in your next role play. So it's a great opportunity to ask questions of teachers and to get feedback from teachers. And it's absolutely okay for you to ask questions and clarify things during your role play session. Okay. It's absolutely fine for you to say, oh, hey, I was thinking of asking this question of the client. Would it be okay, do you think, if I ask that question? It's absolutely fine for you to do that because it is an assessment task, but it is also part of your overall learning experience with us at TAFE Digital. Okay. So that's the purpose of the role play assignments. It's an opportunity for you to demonstrate your practical skills. It's an opportunity for you to show your skills to a teacher. Okay. Now there's a couple of hands I think that are up. Let me just see. So Susan, I think your hand is up.
Hello, everybody. Okay, I've got two questions. One of them just relates to what you were talking about then.
Mm-hmm.
Is it okay to ask for a pause, just for instance, say if you threw, not saying that you would, but just say you threw someone a curveball in the role play, can the person sort of stop and have a little bit of a break and kind of gather their thoughts? And also, I just wanted to ask if you're talking here about role plays where we work with a teacher who's in a scenario, are there likely to be many throughout our courses where we're doing what we did in community development, where you go out and do a live video recording with people, because I've just started asking because I found that people were very hesitant to do it in the same way you were suggesting that people are nervous about role play. So it's very hard to get people to participate.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you for those questions, Susan. So I'll answer the first question first, which is, are you able to kind of have a little pause in the role play? So yes, you absolutely are, because we recognise that role plays, do bring up a little bit of kind of stress and worry for us. And when that happens, sometimes we're not able to think as clearly. Sometimes we might just lose our train of thought. And as Susan said, sometimes something might come up that we kind of weren't necessarily prepared for. So it's absolutely okay for you during a role play to just say, oh, is it okay if we just pause for a moment? I just need a moment to kind of to gather my thoughts. Or I just need a moment, like I just want to check something out with you as the teacher. It's absolutely okay for you to do that. So you can ask to pause the role play, and you step out of the role play into kind of teacher and student, have your chat, clarify things, and then you'll go back into the role play and pick it up. Now, the second question was around how many role plays might we be doing with a teacher versus where we might have to go and interview people kind of at a local service or those kinds of things. So the answer to that is it depends on which course you are in. And I know that is, not the clearest of answers, but I'll give you a very quick breakdown, which is, if you're in the Diploma of Community Services and the Cert 4 of Mental Health, most of your role plays will be done with a teacher in a live setting using Teams, okay? If you're in the Certificate 4 of Community Services or the Certificate 3 of Community Services, you will do around about half of your role plays live with a teacher, but the other half of your role plays you will be recording. So one of the things that we've been working on to try and assist you to kind of find people who are willing to be involved in this is we're setting up, or the Certificate 4 students who are on our TDC platform, we're setting up a Teams page where you can actually interact with each other, because you'll all need to do these role plays. So you've kind of, you can support each other to do the role plays. So we're going to be setting up essentially a bit of a booking sheet where you can put your name down and say that you're getting ready to do the recorded role play for community development. And other students will be able to kind of book there and partner with you. So you can support each other to record your role play sessions, especially if you don't have other people around you that might be able to help you with that. Okay, so that has now gone live on our for the TDC students. Now, I just saw somebody say, what's TDC? So TDC stands for TAFE Digital Campus. So it is the learning platform that our Certificate 4 students are now using. Okay, so TAFE has two different learning platforms at the moment. One of them is called TDC, and it's a very new learning platform. And the other learning platform is the OLS, which our Cert 3 students and our mental health students are all making use of. Okay. So I hope that answered your question, Susan. Pawana, I think you have your hand up as well.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I have a question from you, teacher. Sometimes we cannot participate the online classes. Is it a big problem?
Okay, so great question, Pawana. Because many people study with TAFE Digital because they need that flexibility, because maybe they're working during the day, maybe they have carer responsibilities and these kinds of things, which prevent them from logging into a live webinar like this. So what we are doing is we're recording as many of these webinars as we can So if you're unable to log in and join it live, you can still go back and watch it. The other thing that we're doing is we're in the process of recording short little webinars that discuss just particular content or information for students as well. So we want to try and make these sessions as accessible as possible for people. They're not mandatory. So Pawana, if you can't join a session, that's totally fine. It's not mandatory for you to come along. But we do understand that some folks can't log in, you know, at 1 o'clock on a Thursday, for example. So we are in the process of recording many of the webinars so you can go back and watch them, okay? And those recordings get posted out to students.
Okay, thank you so much.
No worries. Thanks for your question. Hey, folks, I'm going to come to another question, but I just wanted to flag something, which is it's just gone 2 o'clock, and normally we would cover a little bit more information in this session. So I am very happy to stay on this session for, say, another kind of 15 minutes or so we can just cover the last little section that we normally look at in this session. However, if you do need to log out, it's absolutely fine for you to do so. And remember, we're recording this session, so you'll be able to go back and watch that last little 15 minutes if you're somebody that needs to log out because you have a prior arrangement. Serene, you had a question as well. Your hand was up.
Yes. Hi, Glenn. What I'm trying to understand is, so there will be some role plays live with the teachers.
Yes.
And there will be some role plays that we need to do with the fellow students, which would they be like recorded? Because I'm going to be in overseas real soon, and I'm going to be doing my studies from there. And I guess I need to stick with an Australian time and for the live sessions. And for the student role plays, do we do those live as well, or we record them and put them on the system?
Yep, great. Okay, so for the role plays that you do with a teacher, they are done live, and we would be using Australian Eastern Standard Time, essentially. So the live role plays are done in real time. They're not like a pre-recorded thing. They're done in real time. Your recorded role plays, if you're somebody that has recorded role plays, you can record them with your partners at any time you like. You can, you arrange a time with your role play partners that is convenient for everybody. And you can record them using MS Teams, the way we're recording this session now, for example. And you will upload that recording to your learning platform. That's how you'll submit the assignment. You'll upload the recording, and then a teacher will go and watch the recording. Okay. So if you're recording the webinar, the role plays yourself, where it's appropriate to do so, you could record them at 2 a.m. in the morning if that is the time that's most appropriate for you and your role play partners. And then you'll upload it when it's ready to be submitted. Okay. I hope that clarified that question.
Yes, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Okay, so as I mentioned, folks, I'm just going to cover off just a little bit more information that we normally get to, but it's been great because we've got so many students in the session. It's been wonderful because there's been, some really insightful questions. So that's what we want. So a couple of very practical things to be aware of. So you will need to book your role play sessions in, okay? And so the way you book the role plays is by calling the teaching section, okay? So you will call the teaching section and let them know that you're calling to book in your cluster 2 role play, for example. Now, when you call the teaching section, it's useful to have your preferred days and times at hand, because we will try to match your preferred days and times as much as possible. The other thing I always suggest is give yourself about a 2-week lead time to book your role plays. And the reason I suggest that is because we've got about 15,000 students in our courses, and just about all of them will have to do role plays at some point. So there's quite a big demand on role play bookings. Don't kind of leave it to the last minute to book your role play. Give yourself about a 2-week window. So if you know that you're getting ready to do a role play, you might call and try to make a booking for, early March, for example, if I was getting ready for my role plays now. Okay, so give yourself about a 2-week lead time in order to get the time that is going to work best for you. We do have role plays running Monday through to Friday, 9 till 5. We also have role play bookings available outside of office hours. So we do have after hours bookings. We have teachers that do role plays in the mornings, and we also have teachers that will do role plays in the late afternoon and evening. So if you're somebody that might need an out of hours booking, definitely try and call, with about 2 to 3 weeks notice, because those out of hours bookings do fill up relatively quickly as well. Okay. So I'm now just going to have a bit of a chat about how we might structure our role plays. Because for many of us, this might be the very first time we've done a role play. This might be the very first time we've had an opportunity to practice being a community services worker. And so one of the things that lots of students asked us was, how do I start? How do I start my role play? Like, is there a format or a formula I should follow? So what we've done is we've come up with a little bit of a structure that students can use at the beginning of their role play. Okay, so let's have a little bit of a look at that now together. So the first phase of our role play usually is going to be building connection and rapport with our client. Okay, so phase 1 will usually be building connection and rapport with our client. So what I mean by that is we're going to take just a little bit of time at the beginning just to kind of get to know each other a little bit. Because similar to you as a student doing a role play, clients, when they come to a service, are often feeling nervous. They might be worried. They might be really uncertain about what to expect. So we want to take a little bit of time at the beginning just to try and help to connect with them, just to try and help ease those nerves a little bit. So phase 1 is going to be about building rapport and building connection. So we're not going to jump straight into, hi, my name's Glenn, what's brought you here today? Okay, what we're going to do instead is we're going to greet the client, informally introduce ourselves, and it's almost like, if we think about it, it's almost like a little bit of small talk. If we think about it like that, many of us would make small talk on a day-to-day basis. So it might sound something like, we might say something like, oh, hi, Susan, it's so nice to meet you. My name's Glenn. I'm one of the workers here at Indigo. Thanks for coming in today. Shall we go and find a nice private space for you and I to sit and have a chat? How's your morning been? Can I get you a cup of tea, cup of coffee, glass of water? How did you get here today? How did you find out about our service? So we're just taking a little bit of time at the beginning to just connect, to kind of get to know each other. We're not jumping straight into the kind of really big, deep personal questions, okay? This is just about connecting and building rapport. And so, as I said, it might be things like asking how their morning has been. It might be things like asking how they got to the service. It might be things like offering a cup of tea or a glass of water. So phase 1 is we're just taking a little bit of time to build connection and rapport. And that is going to lay the foundation for everything that comes next. Okay, so that rapport building is really important because it's the foundation for everything that comes next. So we've taken a little bit of time to build connection and rapport. Our next phase is we're now going to formally introduce ourselves as the worker. We're going to formally introduce our organisation to our client, and we're going to formally talk about how we're going to work with the client in this session and make sure the client is okay with that. Okay, so that might sound something like, we might say something like, so as I mentioned, Susan, my name's Glenn, and I'm one of the community workers here at Indigo. So I just want to give you a little bit of information about what that means and how we might be working together today in this session. So as a community worker, my role is to partner with you to kind of look at what are the areas that you might be looking for a little bit of extra support in. And we'll come up with a bit of a plan together around how you might be able to access particular supports and services. And if there's anything I can't specifically help you with, I'll be able to connect you with a service that kind of specialises in that area. So over the session, I'll probably ask you a few questions. If there's anything that you don't want to talk about, or if I ask a question and you don't particularly want to answer it, it's absolutely okay for you to say, look, I'd rather not talk about that. And we're kind of going to have a bit of a chat about what's been happening for you. I'm going to be really interested to hear your story. I'm going to be interested to hear about the things that you might be looking for some support with. But I'm also going to be really interested to hear a little bit of information about like the things you enjoy and kind of a little bit of information about the areas of your life that, you know, you're are working well and you're really happy with as well, because I want to get a nice whole picture of who you are. And as I mentioned, we'll then come up with a bit of a plan around how we can best work together to address some of those areas that we chat about. How does all that sound to you at the moment? Is there anything you'd like me to clarify? So that might be how we go about stage 2, our formal introduction. So we're introducing ourselves as the worker, we're talking about our service and how we're going to work with the client. And at the end, we're checking in with them to see if they're okay with that. Now, it's important that we check in with our clients because that's part of our informed consent responsibilities to our clients. It's about making sure that they understand and they're happy to work with us and they're agreeing to work with us. So that's stage 2, our formal introduction. Once we've done our formal introduction, we'll then move on to stage 3. Now, stage 3 is where we're going to explain privacy and confidentiality to our clients and the limits of privacy and confidentiality to our clients. Now, it's really important we do this. Legally, we are required to explain privacy and confidentiality to our clients, but also ethically, it's really important that we explain to our clients how we're going to record and store their information, how we would share their information with any third parties. And also we need to be really transparent around our mandatory reporting obligations to our clients. So stage 3 is where we'll talk about privacy and confidentiality. So that might sound something like, we might say something like, so here at Indigo, we take your rights really seriously. And one of those rights is your right to privacy and confidentiality. So I just want to take a little moment to just explain a little bit to you about what that means. So essentially, everything that you and I talk about in this session will remain private and confidential between you and I and my supervisor. I may need to kind of, pass on some information to my supervisor as well. But everything you and I talk about will be private and confidential between you and I and my supervisor if required. Any notes that I take in this session will also be stored in a way that maintains your privacy and confidentiality. So they'll be locked in a filing cabinet that only myself and my supervisor have access to. And any information that we keep on our computer systems will be password protected to make sure that nobody else can access them as well. If at any point in time you'd like to have a look at your notes, you're very welcome to do so. You can ask to have a look at your notes and we can help you to do that. I won't share any of your information with anybody else unless I have your permission to do so. So for example, if I was going to refer you to another service, I will only share your information with that service if you give me permission to do that. And I'll only share the information that you are happy for me to share, okay? So unless I have your permission to share your information, I won't do that, okay? There are, however, a couple of instances where I may need to share some of your information with a third party. And so those instances are if I believe that you or somebody else is at immediate or urgent risk of very serious harm or danger, I would need to share some information in order to keep you or that other person safe, okay? I'm also what's called a mandatory reporter. And so what that means is legally, if I believe that a child is at risk of significant harm, I'm also required to make a report or share some information with the Department of Communities and Justice. Now, that's not about dobbing on people or trying to get anybody into trouble. That's about trying to keep people as safe as possible. And it might mean that we can access additional supports and resources in order to try and keep people as safe as possible. Outside of those instances, I won't be sharing your information with anybody else unless I have your permission. How's that sound? Would you like me to clarify anything a little bit further? So that's an example of how we might discuss privacy and confidentiality. You will find your own ways of wording it and, you know, finding a way to be comfortable with covering those bits of information. But it's really important that we do that with our clients. And again, that we check in that they kind of agree to that and understand their right to privacy and confidentiality and the limitations on that as well. So that's phase 3. So stage 1, building rapport and connection. Stage 2, formal introduction to yourself as a worker and how you're going to work with the client. Stage 3 is we're talking about privacy and confidentiality and the limitations of privacy and confidentiality. And those 3 stages lay the foundations for us to then kind of springboard into the 4th phase of the role play. And this is the part where students get most excited, because this is where we're now going to start to hear much more about the client's story. So phase 4 is where we're going to then use an open question to invite our client to start sharing their story with us. So in stage 4, we might say things like, so I'm wondering, Jess, if you could tell me a little bit about what's brought you here today. So that's a really general open question that invites the client to start telling us their story. Or we might use a question like, we might say, so Susan, what would make today most helpful and useful for you? So again, this is an open question that invites the client to start telling us their story about what they'd like to focus on. So we're going to use open questions to hear from our client and to hear their story, okay? So this is a structure that you can use for most of your role plays, okay? These kind of 4 stages. Now, what we're going to do, folks, is we're going to have a look at these 4 stages happening in a little pre-recorded example. And what you'll notice is how these 4 stages can flow quite seamlessly into each other and how they set each other up for the stage that comes next. And you'll also notice that it can be done in a relatively short amount of time. So we're just going to watch, say, the first 2.5 to 3 minutes of this video. It's an example that some of my colleagues have made. And you'll notice all 4 stages of this framework happening. It'll come up on the screen, but I'll also kind of point it out as it's happening as well. So let's just watch these first few minutes and see how this framework kind of all fits together. So here's our rapport building. So now we're heading into stage 2, formal introduction to the service and what to expect. So now we're heading into stage 3, privacy and confidentiality. And now we're going to springboard into stage 4 with an open question. So I'm going to pause us there. So we can see that those first 4 stages of our framework for the role play, and they flow quite seamlessly together and happens in about 2.5 to 3 minutes. Now, that link to that video is available on YouTube. So if you wanted to go back and watch that again, you can access that absolutely. And I'll post the link for it in our chat after the meeting as well. But that's just another demonstration or example of how we might kind of structure the opening of our role plays to ensure that we're covering rapport building, to ensure that we're covering the formal introduction and outlining for the client how we're going to work with them, to ensure that we're covering privacy and confidentiality, and then inviting the client to tell us their story. Folks, I'm going to start wrapping up our session if that's okay. Now, I really appreciate how many folks were able to stay on during the session. We got a little bit of a later start because of the mix-up with the links. So thank you so much for your patience with that. So we are about to start wrapping up the session. And I'll just very quickly throw it back over to you to see if there's any last questions or comments that people have. And Jess has just popped on, so I've got a feeling there might be some questions. Go for it.
Yeah, so we've got some questions in the chat here. We just want to make sure we're not missing any. One from Susan talking about the role play. So the max suggested is 20 minutes. What would you suggest for the students the minimum would be to get through those steps?
Okay, so great question. Now, some of your assignments will give you like a guide like that. It will say a maximum of 20 minutes, or it might say things like your role play should run for approximately, and give you a time frame. What I would say is, generally speaking, you would probably be looking anywhere between, say, 10 to 20 minutes for a role play, depending on which role play it is. Because keeping in mind, some of the role plays are a little bit shorter, and they have essentially, like, there's less criteria that you need to demonstrate. And other role plays are going to be a bit longer because there's quite a few criteria that you need to demonstrate. So generally speaking, I would say that role plays go for about 10 to 20 minutes each. Now, that means if you've got 3 clients, so if you're doing an assignment where there's 3 different clients, each of those role plays will go between 10 to 20 minutes, okay? So your booking would usually be for, say, an hour and a half or 2 hours if you're working with 3 clients, okay? So generally speaking, 10 to 20 minutes would be the time frame. And you can at times be guided by that observation checklist. And that's why we really encourage you to have a look at the observation checklist, because it's not just about the time, but it's also about making sure that you have covered each of the items in that checklist, especially if you're doing a recorded role play. You want to make sure that when the teacher watches your recording, they can very easily go, big tick for each of those sections, okay? So it's time, but it's also making sure that you've covered all aspects of the observation checklist. I hope that gave you a bit of a guide there, Susan. Thank you. Any other questions from folks?
I think the chat looks okay, but if there's anything I missed, feel free to jump in.
So what I'm going to do now, folks, just before people log out, is actually, I'm going to stop the recording now, folks. Okay, so just bear with me 1 second. I'm going to stop our recording. Remember, you'll be able to go back and watch this session if you would like to.